The year carried the weight of too many broken promises, and Harlem felt it in the way men walked with their shoulders tight and their eyes lowered, just enough to avoid trouble. It was the kind of tension that didn't shout. It whispered, lingered, settled into doorways and stairwells and church pews, into conversations that stopped when unfamiliar footsteps approached. The city beyond Harlem glittered with power and money, but up here, dignity had become something you guarded the way you guarded your last dollar, quietly, carefully, always aware that someone stronger might try to take it. The streets remembered every injustice, even when the law pretended not to, and memory itself had become a burden people carried in silence. Bumpy Johnson moved through this world without the hurry of frightened men. He walked as if time respected him, as if the city itself made room. There was no swagger in him, no need to announce himself. His power was the kind that came from knowing who you were and refusing to be reduced, even when the world insisted. You should be. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, people leaned in, not because he demanded it, but because his words always carried weight. He dressed simply but with care, his presence dignified without being distant, and those who knew him understood that composure was not weakness in him. It was discipline. What had happened days earlier still echoed in Harlem's veins. A meeting that should have been routine had turned sour, not because of business, but because of humiliation dressed up as authority. Men with badges and influence had spoken down, had reminded everyone in the room where they believed power truly lived, had used race as an unspoken weapon. No blows were struck, no laws technically broken, and that was the cruel brilliance of it. The insult was clean, procedural, impossible to challenge without appearing ungrateful or defiant. For many, it was just another reminder that the rules bent differently depending on who you were. For Bumpy, it was something else entirely. It was a test not of strength, but of restraint. He remembered the looks exchanged after that meeting, the way younger men clenched their jaws, the way older ones stared at the floor, having learned long ago the cost of reacting too quickly. Anger would have been easier. Violence would have been simpler. But Bumpy understood something most men never learned, that the loudest reaction often served the oppressor more than the oppressed. The real battle wasn't about winning the moment, it was about reclaiming dignity without giving your enemy the satisfaction of seeing you lose control. Harlem that night was alive in its own muted way. Music drifted from open windows, blues, notes bending under the weight of lived experience. Laughter spilled out of bars, sometimes forced, sometimes genuine. Couples walked close together, sharing warmth against the cold and against a world that felt increasingly hostile. And beneath it all ran a current of unease, because word traveled fast and everyone knew the balance had shifted. There were rumors always. Rumors about powerful men downtown growing impatient, about deals being rewritten without consent, about consequences waiting quietly in the wings. Bumpy sat at a small table near the back of a club, nursing a drink he barely touched. He wasn't hiding, he simply preferred to observe. From here, he could see the room clearly, who was nervous, who was pretending not to be, who spoke too loudly to cover fear. A young man approached, hesitating before sitting down, his voice low and urgent. He spoke of pressure, of threats made politely but firmly, of doors closing that had once been open. He spoke of feeling trapped. Bumpy listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady. When the man finished, Bumpy didn't offer promises or speeches. He placed a hand on the table and said, calmly, that fear had a way of multiplying when you fed it, and that silence, used wisely, could be a weapon too. The man left lighter than he arrived, not because his problems were solved, but because he felt seen. Across town, the men who believed they owned the night were growing restless. Their world was louder, harsher, built on domination and spectacle. They believed control came from being unpredictable, from reminding everyone that consequences could arrive suddenly and without mercy. In their rooms, power was measured by how quickly others obeyed, by how effectively fear spread. They laughed at restraint, mistook calm for compliance, and assumed that dignity was just another mask that would crack under pressure. They did not understand men like Bumpy, and that misunderstanding would cost them more than they realized. The first real sign of trouble came quietly. A business arrangement was reconsidered. A favor long agreed upon was suddenly delayed. No explanation was given, because none was needed. It was the language of power spoken fluently, polite on the surface, ruthless underneath. People came to Bumpy not asking what to do, but asking how to endure it without losing themselves. He gave them the same answer every time, though rarely in the same words. He told them that survival without dignity was just a slower kind of defeat, and that patience, when chosen freely, was not submission. As days passed, the pressure increased. Meetings were requested and then canceled. Invitations arrived with conditions attached. It became clear that someone wanted a reaction, wanted anger, wanted a mistake that could be punished publicly. Bumpy recognized the pattern immediately. This was not about business. It was about reminding a community of its place. And that, more than any personal slight, was unacceptable. One evening, as rain slicked the streets and reflections trembled in puddles like broken mirrors, Bumpy received word of a meeting that would not be optional. The location was chosen deliberately neutral. Ground, they would call it, though everyone knew neutrality was a myth when power was uneven. The message was respectful enough, but the implication was clear: attend, or watch everything you've built be dismantled piece by piece. The men delivering the message avoided his eyes. They did not threaten him directly, and that was the point. The threat lived in the structure, not the words. That night, Harlem felt unusually quiet, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Bumpy walked alone for a while before heading home, passing places that carried memories, corners where arguments had turned into understanding, doorways where lives had been saved by a timely word instead of a raised hand. He thought of the younger generation watching closely, learning what power looked like from men like him. He understood the responsibility that came with being observed. One reckless act could undo years of careful example. At home, he sat in silence, considering not just what might happen at the meeting, but what it would mean afterward. He knew the kind of men he would face. Men who believed humiliation was a shortcut to obedience. Men who mistook dominance for leadership. He knew they would test him, push him, try to provoke the response they expected. And he knew that whatever he did would ripple outward, shaping how others believed they were allowed to respond to injustice. The injustice itself was no longer abstract. It had names, faces, consequences. Families were already feeling it: lost work, sudden inspections, opportunities evaporating without explanation. All of it was designed to look legitimate, to hide cruelty behind procedure. That was what made it so dangerous. You couldn't fight it head-on without being labeled the problem. You had to expose it for what it was, without giving it new excuses. Bumpy rose before dawn on the day of the meeting, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He dressed carefully, not for display, but out of respect for himself. Outside, the city was waking slowly, unaware of the quiet confrontation approaching. He ate a modest breakfast, said little, and when he stepped out into the morning air, there was no visible sign of the storm waiting ahead. Only those who knew him well would have noticed the stillness about him, the calm that came not from certainty, but from acceptance of responsibility. As he made his way toward the meeting place, he passed people going about their lives, carrying groceries, opening shops, greeting neighbors. They did not know the details, but they felt the tension, the way one feels weather changing before the clouds arrive. Bumpy nodded to a few familiar faces, offered a brief smile, and kept walking. He carried all of them with him, every unspoken hope and fear, into a room where respect was about to be tested. He did not know exactly how the meeting would unfold. He did not need to. What mattered was not control over the outcome, but control over himself. That was the lesson Harlem had taught him again and again. That dignity, once surrendered, was almost impossible to reclaim. And so he walked forward, calm and composed, into a situation designed to strip him of both. Behind him, the city waited. Ahead of him, silence prepared to be broken. The building chosen for the meeting had once been respectable, back when appearances still mattered more than intimidation. Now it stood like a tired relic, its marble floors dulled by years of powerful men walking through without consequence. The kind of place where deals were framed as discussions and threats were disguised as polite suggestions. When Bumpy Johnson entered, the room did not greet him, it assessed him. Eyes measured, weighed, and underestimated him all at once. He noticed everything: the way chairs were arranged to place him slightly off-center, the pause before anyone spoke, the silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional. This was not coincidence. This was choreography. He took his seat without comment, folding his hands calmly, his posture relaxed but alert. The men across from him wore confidence the way others wore uniforms, convinced it granted authority. Their smiles were thin, calculated, meant to remind him that he was present by permission, not right. The conversation began. Politely enough, circling around logistics, obligations, and changing circumstances, but the tone carried an undercurrent of condescension that grew sharper with every minute. They spoke over him once, then twice, correcting him unnecessarily, explaining things he already understood. It was subtle, practiced, and cruel in its restraint. The injustice wasn't shouted. It was implied, layered into every word. Bumpy listened, unblinking. Inside him, memories stirred of earlier years, earlier lessons learned the hard way. He remembered watching men before him lose everything not because they were wrong, but because they reacted too quickly. Anger had always been the trap. These men wanted anger. They wanted him loud, emotional, visible in his resistance, so they could label it aggression, so they could justify what came next. He refused to give it to them. Instead, he asked a simple question, his voice steady, almost gentle. It was a fair question, one that exposed the imbalance without accusing anyone directly. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared his throat. Fairness was not part of the script. The response came quickly, sharper now, less patient. The language changed. Where there had been politeness, there was now pressure. Where there had been implication, there was now suggestion. They spoke of consequences without naming them, of cooperation as though it were generosity rather than expectation. And then, almost casually, they referenced Harlem not as a community, but as leverage. The message was clear: compliance would bring stability. Resistance would bring discomfort to people who had nothing to do with the meeting. It was collective punishment disguised as pragmatism. That was when Bumpy understood this was no longer about him alone. The injustice had crossed a line. He felt it settle in his chest, not as rage, but as resolve. Still, he did not react. He allowed the silence after their words to stretch, long enough to make them uneasy. Silence, he knew, made people reveal themselves. And it worked. One of them laughed softly, a sound meant to diminish, to remind him of his place. Another leaned back, satisfied, as if the outcome were already decided. Outside that room, the consequences were already unfolding. Inspections increased. Permits stalled. Men who had done nothing wrong found themselves questioned, delayed, inconvenienced into desperation. It was death by 1,000 small cuts, and everyone knew where it was coming from. Harlem felt it immediately. The fear was quieter now, more focused. People spoke in lower voices. Doors closed earlier. Hope began to feel like something dangerous to express. Bumpy walked those streets that evening, listening more than speaking, absorbing the weight being placed on others in his name. Mothers asked him what would happen next, not demanding answers, just reassurance. Young men watched him closely, searching his face for signs of weakness or fury, learning from his restraint whether dignity was still possible under pressure. He gave them neither promises nor speeches. He gave them presence. And that, somehow, steadied them. Meanwhile, the men who believed they were winning grew bolder. They mistook his silence for retreat. Another message arrived, less polite than the last. Another meeting was scheduled, this time with fewer smiles and clearer expectations. The location was different, smaller, more enclosed, chosen to unsettle. This was escalation. And everyone felt it. The night before the second meeting, Bumpy slept little. Not from fear, but from thought. He considered every possible outcome. Not just for himself, but for the people who would bear the consequences of his choices. He knew violence would end it quickly, but at a cost too high to accept. He knew surrender would protect some in the short term, but poison everything in the long run. The path he needed was narrower, harder, and demanded absolute control. He had to expose injustice without feeding it. He had to shift power without force. When he arrived at the second meeting, the atmosphere was openly hostile. The room was tighter, the faces harder. One man stood behind another, a little too close, a silent reminder of force waiting in the background. The conversation skipped pleasantries entirely. Demands were made plainly now, expectations stated without apology. And then, deliberately, one of them spoke of an incident twisting the truth, just enough to frame Harlem as ungrateful, difficult, problematic. It was a lie polished until it almost looked respectable. That was when the real test came. Bumpy felt every eye on him, waiting for the moment he would snap or plead or threaten. Instead, he did something unexpected. He asked them to repeat themselves, slowly, clearly. The room hesitated, then complied. As they spoke, the ugliness of their position revealed itself. The logic didn't hold. The justifications contradicted each other. And in that moment, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't oppressive. It was clarifying. Still, they pushed. They leaned forward now, voices raised just enough to feel dangerous. One of them mentioned protection. Another mentioned how quickly things could spiral if cooperation wasn't forthcoming. And then, just as tension peaked, a small sound cut. Through the room, the faint movement of a chair, the subtle shift of a man standing where he hadn't been before. The presence of force no longer hidden, but not yet used. The room held its breath. Bumpy did not look at the man behind them. He did not acknowledge the threat directly. He looked only at the one speaking, and when he finally responded, his voice was calm, almost regretful. He said that power used to punish innocence always collapses under its own weight. He said that history was unkind to men who mistook control for respect. And he said it without accusation, without drama, as though stating a simple fact rather than issuing a warning. The effect was immediate, though not explosive. The room did not erupt. Instead, something colder crept in: uncertainty. They had expected defiance or fear. They had received neither, and that unsettled them more than any threat could have. The meeting ended without resolution, without agreement, without victory for either side. But as Bumpy left, he understood something crucial. The pressure had reached its peak. Whatever came next would define everything. Outside, the night air felt heavier than before. Harlem waited, tense and watchful. The injustice had sharpened, the stakes had risen, and silence was no longer neutral. It had become a weapon, one that could either crush them all or be turned, carefully, against those who believed they owned it. And somewhere not far away, men who trusted violence more than wisdom were preparing to force an ending. By the time the third meeting was arranged, no one pretended it was business anymore. The language had changed, stripped of courtesy, sharpened by impatience. The invitation arrived without warmth, without explanation, and without alternatives. It was not a request. It was an expectation. Harlem understood that difference instinctively. People felt it in their routines, in the way police presence thickened without cause, in the way inspections appeared unannounced and lingered longer than necessary. The pressure was no longer subtle. It had become visible, deliberate, and cruel. Bumpy. Johnson understood something else as well. This meeting would not end the way the others had. The men across the table were done testing. They were tired of silence. Silence to them felt like defiance. And defiance, in their world, demanded correction. The location was chosen carefully. Not neutral ground this time, but territory meant. To intimidate low ceilings, dim light, no windows close enough to see out of. The kind of place where voices echoed just enough to make every word feel heavier. When Bumpy entered, conversation stopped entirely. Not out of respect, but calculation. They watched him closely now, not as an obstacle to manage, but as a problem to eliminate. He sat without being invited. That alone unsettled them. The man who spoke first did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was flat, efficient, as if reading terms that had already been approved. He spoke of cooperation as though it were overdue, of consequences as though they were inevitable. He spoke of Harlem again, this time without disguise, naming the ways pressure could be applied until compliance became survival. It was collective punishment spoken calmly, confidently, as though morality were irrelevant once power had been established. Behind him stood a bodyguard, silent, alert, his presence unmistakable. He was close enough for Bumpy to hear the faint sounds of his movement, the controlled breathing, the barely perceptible shift of weight from one foot to the other. This man was trained not to think, only to act when required. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to end things if words failed. Bumpy listened, his expression unchanged. Inside him, however, the calculation was precise. He knew exactly what they were doing. This was escalation designed to provoke a mistake. They wanted a raised voice, a threat, a single word that could be twisted into justification. They wanted him to become what they already believed him to be. When the speaker finished, the silence that followed was deliberate, heavy, expectant, the kind of silence meant to force a response. Bumpy did not rush to fill it. He looked at the man speaking, then slowly at the others around the table, meeting each gaze without challenge, without submission. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and unmistakably calm. He did not argue the demands directly. He did not deny their power. Instead, he asked a question, quiet, almost reflective, about responsibility. About what kind of legacy men leave when they mistake fear for loyalty. About how many people must suffer quietly so that a few can feel powerful for a moment longer. The reaction was not immediate anger, but irritation. One of them laughed, short and sharp. Another leaned back, dismissive. They had not come to be lectured. The speaker interrupted him, voice raised now, authority cracking into aggression. He reminded Bumpy exactly where he was, exactly who controlled the room. And then he gestured subtly. The bodyguard shifted. It was not dramatic. No gun was raised. No threat spoken aloud. Just a small, unmistakable sound, the faint mechanical click of readiness, barely audible but impossible to misunderstand. It cut through the room with surgical precision. Every man present felt it land. This was no longer implied force. This was proximity. This was consequence standing less than an arm's length away. For a moment, time itself seemed to hesitate. This was the point where stories usually ended badly. Where dignity was traded for survival. Where men lashed out, begged, or broke. The bodyguard's finger rested exactly where it had been trained to rest, waiting not for orders, but for permission. Bumpy did not look at the weapon. That was the moment that changed everything. He kept his eyes on the man who had brought them here, the man who believed control justified everything. And when he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He did not plead. He said only this, that violence used to silence truth does not make truth disappear. It only makes cowards louder for a moment. And that men who need weapons to feel respected are already defeated, whether they realize it or not. There was no accusation in his tone, no drama. Just certainty. The bodyguard felt it before he understood it. His breathing shifted. His grip loosened not consciously, not as a decision, but as a reaction to something unexpected. He had been trained to respond to fear, to resistance, to aggression. What stood in front of him now was none of those things. It was calm, it was dignity. And it unsettled him deeply. The room fell silent in a different way than before. Not the silence of intimidation, but the silence of exposure. The kind that follows when something ugly has been dragged into the light without force. One of the men cleared his throat. Another looked away. The speaker hesitated, just long enough for everyone to notice. Bumpy stood, slowly, deliberately. No one stopped him. He said one final thing, not as a warning, but as a truth. He said that Harlem would endure this pressure the same way it had endured everything else, with patience, memory, and dignity. And that history would remember who stood calmly when cruelty demanded submission. Then he turned and walked toward the door. No one followed. No one spoke. The bodyguard stared at the floor, his heart pounding, realizing that the sound he had made, the sound meant to end a life, had instead exposed something hollow in the men who gave him orders. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper. Bumpy stepped into it without hurry, without triumph. He knew the danger was not over. But he also knew something had shifted permanently. Power had been challenged not with violence, but with restraint. And restraint, when chosen freely, had proven stronger than fear. Behind him, the men inside the room sat in silence, confronted with a truth they could not threaten away. The next move would be theirs, and whatever they chose, the world would see it clearly now. The city did not change all at once. It never does. Change arrived the way truth usually does, slowly, unevenly, and without ceremony. The morning after the final meeting, Harlem woke to the same streets, the same storefronts, the same routines, but something underneath had shifted. People felt it without being able to name it. Conversations lingered longer. Doors opened a little wider. Fear did not vanish, but it loosened its grip just enough for dignity to breathe again. The men who had relied on pressure and intimidation discovered something unsettling. Their threats no longer carried the same certainty. Orders were followed more slowly. Compliance came with questions. The machinery of control still existed, but it had begun to grind instead of glide. Silence, once used as a weapon against Harlem, had turned back on those who wielded it. And silence, when it turns, is merciless. Bumpy Johnson did not celebrate. He did not give speeches or claim victory. He returned to his routines, his measured walks through the neighborhood, his quiet conversations with people who mattered. That restraint was itself a message. Power, he understood, did not need announcement. It needed consistency. The young men who watched him closely noticed this most of all, not the confrontation, not the danger, but the aftermath. He did not become louder once the threat passed. He did not posture. He remained exactly who he had been before, and that steadiness taught them more than any lesson ever could. Downtown, unease spread among men who were not accustomed to it. They replayed the meeting in their minds, not the words spoken, but the absence of reaction they had failed to break. They had prepared for resistance, not composure, for violence, not dignity. And the bodyguard, the one whose hand had hovered where no hand should, found himself waking at night to that sound he had made, the faint click that had meant to end something and instead exposed everything. He understood now that he had been standing at the edge of a line history did not forgive easily. That realization stayed with him longer than fear ever had. Pressure did not disappear immediately. It softened in places, shifted in others. But it was no longer invisible. Journalists began asking questions, not the loud ones, but the careful ones. Community leaders spoke with a little more confidence. The machinery of quiet cruelty depended on nobody looking too closely, and now people were looking. Not because Bumpy had demanded it, but because his restraint had made the injustice undeniable. Violence would have justified repression. Silence had forced scrutiny. One evening, as dusk settled over Harlem, Bumpy stood outside a small storefront, watching a man close up for the night. The owner thanked him, not extravagantly, not dramatically, just a simple nod of gratitude that carried more weight than applause. It was the kind of moment no newspaper recorded, no history book captured. Yet it mattered more than any public victory. Dignity restored does not announce itself. It settles. There were still dangers, there always are. But the nature of the danger had changed. The men who once acted freely now hesitated, aware that their power had limits they had never acknowledged. Before, they understood, perhaps too late, that authority enforced only by fear collapses the moment fear stops working. And fear had stopped working. Bumpy's influence spread not through command, but through example. People spoke of him not as a savior, but as a standard. When younger men faced provocation, they remembered how he had stood still when everything demanded reaction. When anger tempted them, they recalled how restraint had achieved what force never could. That memory became armor. Quiet, effective, enduring. Time passed, as it always does. Names that once dominated headlines faded into footnotes. Deals that had seemed permanent dissolved. Men who believed themselves untouchable discovered that history is patient, but not forgetful. And through it all, Harlem endured not untouched, not unscarred, but unbroken. One night, long after the tension had eased into memory, Bumpy sat alone in his home, the city humming softly beyond the window. He did not think of himself as having won anything. Winning implied opposition still mattered. What he felt instead was something deeper, heavier, and far more satisfying. Alignment. His actions had matched his principles. His restraint had protected others without costing them their dignity. And that, to him, was the only measure that counted. Outside, the streets carried on. Laughter rose from a block away. Music drifted through the air. Life, stubborn and resilient, continued. Somewhere downtown, men who once believed power belonged only to them moved more cautiously now, haunted not by violence, but by the memory of a man who had refused to give them the reaction they needed to justify their cruelty. History would not remember every detail of those meetings. It rarely does. But it would remember this, that in a moment designed to humiliate, silence had been chosen over submission, dignity over destruction, restraint over rage. And that choice had changed the shape of power without spilling a single drop of blood. In the end, that was the real legacy, not dominance, not fear, but the quiet, unyielding proof that justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in a calm voice, in a steady gaze, in a man who stands still when the world demands he kneel. And when the city finally exhaled, it did so knowing this truth. Power that needs violence to survive is already dying. Power that refuses it is remembered.